What's going on, guys? Welcome back to a brand new video on the channel. Inside of today's video, we're going to be ranking all 49 hyperchargers in the game right now, from the very worst all the way up to the very best in a tier list. So it's going to help you guys decide which hyperchargers to buy with coins and gems, and the ones to not get excited about when you get them out of a star drop. And of course, you don't want to purchase the really bad ones. So of course, before we get into the video, make sure to subscribe, because balance changes are arriving this week, and I'll keep you guys up to date the best with the metas. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So starting off with probably the worst hypercharger in the game, we have Pearl's Hypercharge. So with the Hypercharge Super, it creates a burning effect, but then Pearl's Super knocks you out of that burning effect. The Hypercharge is just terrible and definitely one of the worst. Next up in the F tier, we have Miko's Hypercharge. So I won't say it's the absolute worst in a 1v1. It actually can be very helpful, but the problem is it takes a long time to cycle through to it. And with Miko's Super in general, it's just really easy to avoid and hard to get a lot of value from. For that reason, it has to be in the F tier. Next, we have Sprout's Hypercharge. So whenever you activate your Hypercharge Super, it will leave like a bush area that deals a lot of damage. The problem is no one's even going to get close to it. I don't think I've ever dealt any damage to an opponent with it. It's only good onto the high save, and it's Sprout. He's never going to be able to get onto the high save against accomplished players. So for that reason, it's absolutely F tier. Next up in the F tier, we have Nani's Hypercharge. So this one just doesn't make a lot of sense, because you basically waste your Hypercharge duration just sitting in your Super, and then even at that, sometimes the Hypercharge Super actually makes it a bit more awkward to hit. A lot of times it still doesn't one-shot the opponent. I just don't really understand it. The stat boosts are terrible as well. It is just not worthwhile getting. So in the F tier, we have Poco's Hypercharge. So I'm yet to really get a lot of value out of this one. The only good thing about it is that he cycles through to it pretty quickly, but the Hypercharge Super is just not that good in theory. You think it might be good giving your teammates an overheal, but the shield decays so incredibly fast, and you're basically wasting the Super if you're just healing up people at maximum HP. So yeah, it just doesn't make sense. It's terrible. And lastly, in the F tier, we have Brock's Hypercharge. So still, after some buffs, it's still one of the worst in the game. You see in pro play that people actually use Brock's Super and then activate Hypercharge for that additional stat boost, because the Hypercharge Super itself is just terrible. But there is a fine line between making it broken and really bad. So I can see why they're not buffing it too much, but it's still in the F tier. But I'm going to be moving on to the D tier, starting off with Charlie's Hypercharge. So in theory, it's not actually that good, but at least you can get a little bit of value from it, because typically you pick Charlie into snipers, which are just countered by those spiders, and those spiders from the Hypercharge can actually be pretty helpful in some situations. So it's at least okay. So with the D tier, we have Jean's Hypercharge. So the Hypercharge Super itself is pretty terrible. The reason why it's in a D tier though is because of the stat boost. It actually enables you to just get in position a lot easier and at least find an opponent to pull. Also, the Hypercharge Super hand is a lot quicker as well, which can be useful if you want to get a quick takedown. So for me, that's the only good thing about it. Everything else is just meh. With the D tier, we have Fang's Hypercharge. I would actually put this in the F tier myself, just because of how ridiculously long it takes to build up this Hypercharge. Against good players, you're probably never going to get a Hypercharge. It took me about 10 games to get a Hypercharge Super. That's how long it takes in Brawl. The Hypercharge Super itself is pretty good, but again, since everyone's got all these Hypercharges, etc., I just think you don't get a lot of value out of Fang's Super anymore. So yeah, it absolutely is minimum at D tier. So we have Emz's Hypercharge. So with the Hypercharge Super, you knock back opponents, and there's a little bit of spray of damage, which doesn't really do anything. The knockback itself is pretty useful, but outside of that, it doesn't really take Emz to a new level. It's just basically she's got another gadget usage. So yeah, I don't really like this. Next with the D tier, we have Primo's Hypercharge. So again, Hypercharge Super itself isn't that great, but it's more to do with the stat boost. You can get a lot of good plays with it. The additional shield and speed can really help you just close in on opponents easier, but the Hypercharge Super is terrible, so it's just not worthwhile picking up. Next up, we have Daryl's Hypercharge. So one of the new ones, which I think everyone predicted this, but at the same time, I think it is still useful. The shield boost and the speed boost is definitely worthwhile, especially because you can make so many more plays, just tank a lot, especially with the Steel Hoop Star power. On top of that, you can cycle through supers really effectively with this Hypercharge, but that's about it. It basically deals no additional damage, so it's not useful for that. It's just only for stat boosts. Next up, we have 8-Bit. So 8-Bit, another new Hypercharge, which is very lackluster. I'm yet to really get much value out of the Hypercharge turret itself. Yeah, it might charge and help charge up your next 8-Bit turret, but a lot of the times, if you're throwing your 8-Bit turret in the open, it's just going to get destroyed straight away. You know, it's not going to deal a lot of damage to the opponents. 230 damage is very lackluster. The good thing about it, though, you get those speed boosts, which is really beneficial for 8-Bit, but outside of that, it's just meh. Lastly, in the D tier, we have Squeak's Hypercharge. So I have seen a few times where the Squeak Hypercharge Super can come in clutch. Literally during the World Finals, Boss got a really good Hypercharge Super, which saved the game. But really outside of that, it's just so unpredictable. And most of the times, the extra super just ends up way across the map, not even affecting the play. So for me, it's only really good for the stat boost. So now moving on to the C tier, starting off with a new hypercharge with Otis's hypercharge. So right now it's currently bugged, so you could probably maybe put this in the D tier, because if you guys didn't know, it actually reverts your star power. So you actually have 3 projectiles instead of 4 when your hypercharge is active, which makes no sense. But the hypercharge super itself is actually surprisingly pretty decent. So I think once the bug has been fixed, maybe B tier, it can help you get that kill. But the problem is with his hypercharge super is that you're not going to be able to get a team wipe, and it's really hard to cycle through Otis super. So you only have that one hypercharge, you get that kill, but there's nothing else to it. So we have Tick's hypercharge. So the hypercharge super itself can sometimes be good, but for the most part, the Tick head is just going to get deleted too quickly in this meta. Also, the Tick mines very rarely get value. If you're dumb enough to walk into it, yeah, it can deal a lot of damage. The hypercharge rate was buffed not too long ago, so helping it out a little bit, but I still feel like most of the time it's just very lackluster. So we have Shelly, so one of the first hypercharge brawlers in the game. The hypercharge super is very boring and uninspiring, but just because you can cycle through it pretty quickly and just get a lot of value out of the hypercharge super, I still find it pretty effective. So we have Colt's hypercharge. So just like Shelly's, all it is a bigger super, which isn't the greatest, but it still helps you clip a lot more. That hypercharge super can have some decent value, and a stat boost as well. It's really good in high, especially because you literally use Colt as a damage dealer, so just a stat boost is just good enough for it. Next up, we have the same problem again with Spike, where the hypercharge super is one of the first batches to come out, and all it is a bigger super, which can sometimes be good. It's like a mini loose super for aerial denial, but a lot of the times it's just flashier supers out there, and it doesn't really take him to that new level. So we have Bell's hypercharge super, which homes into opponents, so pretty much you're never going to miss that super, but the super is pretty easy to hit anyway. I actually find the stat boosts are really good with Bell. You just end up just taking over the map for whatever reason. Normally it's pretty hard to get value out of snipers that have hypercharges, but I like Bell's, maybe secretly B tier. And lastly in the C tier, we have Angelo's hypercharge. So that hypercharge super itself is actually really good. You can get a lot of pressure with it. It's just a problem that it takes forever to charge up. You very, very rarely get this hypercharge super unless you're hitting every single shot possible. So C tier is pretty fair. So now moving on to the B tier, start off with Rosa. The hypercharge super itself isn't anything flashy, but the stat boost, the speed, the shield on top of the damage reduction Shorty gets with her super makes her unstoppable in hypercharge form. And then you get a slow as well, just helps you close the gap with the opponents even easier. I think it's a good hypercharge. People sleep on it. So we have Maisie's hypercharge. So I know that Maisie sucks in terms of just hitting your shots, but the hypercharge itself definitely carries her. If we go back to the Maisie hypercharge meta, it was game breaking. It just deleted everybody on the map. So the hypercharge super itself can make some really good plays in combination with the gadget, but the problem is it's just so hard to build it up in this meta. So B tier is where she's at. Next up, we have Jackie. So the hypercharge super itself just slows opponents in a big radius when you use your super, which doesn't sound amazing, but the stat boost with Jackie just makes it so toxic. It's so hard to take her down when it's just that random Jackie running at you with a hypercharge in Brawl Ball. It's one of the scariest ones in the game, in my opinion, because of that speed and shield boost that she gets. So for that reason, it's absolutely B tier. Next we have Cordelius' hypercharge. So whenever he uses hypercharge super, he will slow the opponents down so much, so you can get an easy kill. So for that reason, it's very good. The biggest drawback is that it takes a while to charge through to his hypercharge super, just because you don't get that super back when you put someone in the Shadow Realm, but you still charge it automatically through his charging circle. So a lot of benefits to it. It's nothing broken, but it's definitely very good. Next we have Bull's hypercharge. So when you activate your hypercharge super, you'll tank so much incoming damage, where you basically can just fly at anybody and you'll survive and you'll cycle through to your next super. So this allows Bull to just make some really good plays and get some team wipes. So for that reason, it has to be B tier. Without his hypercharge, he'll probably be the worst brawler in the game. Next up, we have Piper's hypercharge. So whenever she jumps, she'll drop more bombs, and then where she lands, she'll also break terrain and knock people back. For that reason, it can be very versatile and make for some interesting plays. You also fly a lot quicker, so you can just surprise people quickly. The damage boost on top of it is really nice as well. This is definitely a hypercharge worth buying. Next up, we have Crow's hypercharge. So the hypercharge super itself isn't anything crazy. People seem to think that it will just get team wipes. A lot of times it's very very lackluster, but at the same time, in Heist, it's an absolute game changer. You can deal pretty much 50% high safe damage, which is insane with the Carrying Crow star power. You've also got Spirit Wars as well, where it's very, very good in. So for that reason, it just has to be B tier because of how much damage it can do to something stationary. So with the B tier, we have Jesse's Hypercharge. So all it does is just a bigger Jesse turret, which is okay for wasting ammo. The reason why it's even in a B tier is because it cycles through so quickly. You get it less than 2 supers, so for that reason it's good. This used to be like an S tier Hypercharge, but just because it's just starting to get power crept, because yeah, there's not much to it other than just wasting the opponent's ammo. And lastly, in the B tier, we have Nita's Hypercharge. So this easily could be in the A tier as well. It cycles through with only 2 supers. But again, the only thing going for it is just that it wastes a lot of opponent's ammo. And if the opponents just all focus on that Hypercharge super really quickly, it's just still going to get deleted pretty fast. But it can lead to some interesting moments, especially in Heist as well. So it's still a decent one. So now moving on to the A tier, starting off with Barley. Barley's Hypercharge takes a while to actually build up, but the Hypercharge itself is so good for aerial denial. It does a lot of damage and people underrate it. It's especially a big reason as to why Barley is somewhat meta right now. So definitely recommend getting this Hypercharge. So we have Edgar's Hypercharge. So on release, this Hypercharge was crazy broken, but as the game's gone on, it's definitely got power crept a lot. It takes a lot longer to build up this Hypercharge as well. And just because of how bad Edgar is, it seems like it takes forever to actually get the Hypercharge against good players. But the Hypercharge itself gives you a reload speed buff and a supercharge buff, which is actually pretty nice. And against good matchups, it can completely dominate and take over the game. So it just depends on matchups, but definitely still a good Hypercharge. So we have BB's Hypercharge. So every time you hit a Hypercharge super, it will split off into 2 bubbles instead of 1, which can actually cause a lot of chaos. I'm actually really loving this Hypercharge, especially in the new game mode Spirit Wars. In Brawl or just any map with a lot of walls, you can get so much value from this. And also the speed boost and the shield boost with BB is so good. It allows this play so aggressively, so I like it a lot for that reason. So in the A tier, we have Stu's Hypercharge. So I was a bit skeptic on whether I'd be able to cycle this enough because it takes like 25 shots to build up this Hypercharge, but I believe you could easily cycle this at least once, maybe even twice a game. The Hypercharge super allows you to get infinite Stu supers, which it doesn't, you know, you're not going to get some crazy team wipes, whatever, but the mobility and the pressure you can get with this alone, especially if you're a good Stu player, it can do a lot of work. So I think people underestimate it. It's definitely a good one. So we have Sandy's Hypercharge. So with the Hypercharge super, you will mute people upon impact of the super, and your whole team will get a speed boost. So the reason why this Hypercharge is so good, because the Hypercharge technically lasts the whole duration of the Sandy Sandstorm. So it lasts a full 10 seconds of you and your teammates getting that speed boost, and you can just overwhelm the opponent so easily. It does take a while to cycle through to it since the Hypercharge nerf not too long ago, but it's still a really good. So we have Lou's Hypercharge. So the Hypercharge super itself instantly freezes people, and it's still one of the best in terms of its mechanics. It's just so good at confirming kills and just turning around the game. So for that reason, it's absolutely A tier, maybe even S tier. The reason why it's a bit lower is because Lou's just really hard to get super with in this meta, and it does take a while to cycle through to it. You need a good first super to get a Hypercharge one eventually, but so many game-changing plays can happen with it. So we have Colette's Hypercharge. So the reason why it's so good is because the Spirit allows you to cycle through the super so fast. Whenever the Spirit from the Hypercharge super hits someone, it only deals 1,000 damage, but the cycling, as I said, is insane. You instantly get back your super if you hit somebody with the Hypercharge super, so that can just mean you just delete people across the map. It deals 25% to the high safe, of course, a big reason why the Hypercharge super is good. It just shreds through tanks. So we have Buzz's Hypercharge. So with Buzz's Hypercharge, you get infinite uses of your super as long as you keep hitting walls and whatever. You basically turn into Spider-Man. You can just go across the map, make some crazy plays. You can also stun lock people if they're close to a wall. There's just so many mechanical plays you can make with this Buzz Hypercharge. You also get it automatically through his charging circle. I think it's a great one. Finally, in the A tier, we have Tara's Hypercharge. So with this Hypercharge, you just get a much bigger Tara super, which didn't sound too fancy at first, but the turnaround plays you can make with this are absolutely insane, and it helps even more so that you break up terrain as well, which I thought might actually hurt Tara, but after trying it out a lot since the update a couple of months ago, I've just realized just how good the turnaround plays you can make with Tara. It leads to at least you getting 2 people in that Tara super every single time, maybe even 3. And that itself just makes for so many turnaround plays and team wipes. And that's why Hypercharges are good. And Tara is definitely one of those brawlers to make those plays happen. So now we're going to be moving on to the S tier, starting off with a new Hypercharge. It is Penny's Hypercharge. So everyone was really scared of this Hypercharge because it shoots 2 shots. Some people are saying that it's not the best because it doesn't you know, doesn't shoot at different angles, but I still think it's really good. It's still double the shots and still doubled the area coverage of what it was before. Again, it does take a little while to cycle through to it, but in special game modes, maps, you're just not going to be able to take this turret down. You think of Spirit Wars, you think of Jordan Beetles, you think of Hot Zone, you think of all of these different scenarios where you can get a really defensive hypercharged turret. It is just so toxic and so good for control, so it absolutely has to be S tier. So in the S tier, we have another new hypercharge. It is Ruff's hypercharge. So with his hypercharge super, it will fully charge up anybody's hypercharge on his team. So that itself is just absolutely crazy. And then what you can do as well with Ruff's, once your hypercharge actually runs out, so you throw the hypercharge super, let the hypercharge run out, you can then pick up that supply drop and build up your hypercharge again for free. So you can basically like infinitely cycle your hypercharge. And then of course there's a lot of cheesy plays, especially in competitive play, where you can give a hypercharge super to, I don't know, like a Crow with Crow Jump. You can give it to Fang, who takes forever to charge his hypercharge. You know, you can really abuse this in competitive play. So yeah, I'm going to be scared of this one once the pros get their hands on it. So in the S tier, we have Mortis's hypercharge. So with his hypercharge, he will basically boomerang his bats back to him, so dealing double the damage. The reason why this is just so crazy broken is the fact that you can literally, all you have to do is line up 2 people, which is easy with Mortis's bats. Use the mythic gear and you can cycle through your hypercharge super like crazy. It just leads to so many team wipes. Again, you don't even have to get close to them. Normally Mortis, you have to literally get on top of them and cycle your bats like that. No, you can just snipe them across the map, through walls, lifesteal. It is just so broken. The only non-broken thing about it, which isn't making it the best hypercharge in the game, is that it got a hypercharge rate nerf not too long ago, but everything else just leads to it being absolutely S tier. Next up in the S tier, we have Leon's hypercharge. So with his hypercharge super, he's able to shoot while staying invisible. So mechanically, this is absolutely insane. As the months have gone by, it's received small nerfs to make it so you don't get the hypercharge as frequently, but it's still an absolute menace. The amount of damage that you can do whilst you're still invisible is just crazy. It just enables you to make so many plays, and especially if you're up against noobs, they're just not going to have a clue what's even coming their way. So this is definitely a hypercharge worth getting. So we have Frank's hypercharge. So with the hypercharge super, he will do a Frank stun in a 360 around him. There's a few points where you can avoid this, and also it's not always the best to, you know, fully open a map when you're Frank, but he charges his hypercharge so incredibly fast, and the stat boosts are absolutely crazy. The shield boost you get on this, it feels like Frank is immortal. If you've tried facing off against him, you just can't kill him when his hypercharge popped, and he'll cycle it 3-4 times a game with ease. So absolutely S tier. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to the best 5 hypercharges in the game. Starting off at number 5 with Dynamite's hypercharge. So with his hypercharge, it will deal additional damage, and then after the Dynamite actually explodes, there'll be more Dynamite sticks, which also don't deal a lot of damage, but it helps build up his next super. So the reason why that's important is because then he can get multiple hypercharge supers off within those 5 seconds. So then he can get 2-3 Dynamite supers, which deal like 8k damage. The team wipe potential is absolutely insane. So absolutely is S tier, one of the best for sure. Next up is the 4th best hypercharge in the game right now. We have Max's hypercharge. In pro play, this is disgustingly broken, because if you all group up in the same spot in 3 versus 3, you'll be able to charge through to 3/4 of your next super, which is insane, and all your teammates will as well. So Max throws out an energy drink that charges 25% of your super, but of course if you all group up, that's 75%, and it just leads to you and your team just steamrolling the opposition. You're able to cycle through multiple Max hypercharges as well within those 5 seconds, which is just crazy. And there's also some broken synergies for like Ruffs and other brawlers as well, so it's definitely a frightening hypercharge. The speed boost lasts for a very long time as well. I believe it's like 3 or 4 times as long as a normal Max super. So yeah, it's a crazy hypercharge. So now moving into the 3rd best hypercharge in the game right now, we have Surge's hypercharge. So whenever he uses it, his attacks will split, and especially if you use the hypercharge super, it will gain additional range as well. So this is just absolutely filthy. At first I was like, is this going to be that good? Because sometimes the extra range might not benefit you, but once people have mastered it, you can just deal some insane damage. The stat boosts on top of it are just disgusting, and that's why he's actually receiving a hypercharge rate nerf in the next few days, which, you know, time will tell whether it will still be a strong hypercharge or not. I still think minimum it will be A tier after the nerf, but absolutely right now it's in the top 3. Moving on to the 2nd best hypercharge in the game right now, I went with Rico's hypercharge. So after contemplating, I've realized that Rico isn't as skillful as he used to be. This hypercharge is just unbroken on Rico maps. It's just insane. The team wipe potential is through the roof, And a lot of times you won't even know that you're going to get a kill. Your hypercharge will just keep bouncing and bouncing and bouncing, just like the Rico mutation. It feels like you just can't escape it. It's just way too strong. You can cycle through to it so quickly, get 2 free hypercharges in one game, and it just leads to multiple team wipes without even really needing too much skill. So yeah, it's absolutely one of the best in the game. Okay, so now moving into the best hypercharge in the game right now. Might be a surprise to you guys, but I think it's absolutely the Gale hypercharge. The biggest drawback though is that it recently got nerfed, and it takes a while to charge through, but you can get it 1, maybe 2 times in a game, and it leads to team wipes without even needing to think. So you get 2 Gale supers. You might think, well, that just sounds underwhelming. Well, if you use 2 Gale supers and with a stun star power, oh, I actually don't even need that. You can just run up to the 3 players who are behind walls, cycle through to another hypercharge super, and then you can get 3, 4 hypercharge supers, and then you literally just kill the whole team with just only your hypercharge super, which is just bizarre to me, absolutely crazy. I think this will get like some sort of rework maybe in the future after all the hypercharges are released. I don't know, it's just so crazy strong right now that the only way to nerf it is to make it really hard to get in a single game. So yeah, that's it for today's video. Let me know what you think is the best hypercharge in the game. Again, I've mainly based this on a few things, on how long it takes to charge up, its team wipe potential, whether the brawlers actually, needs the hypercharge. Would it be the same in a meta without it? Some of these brawlers like Pearl, for example, you won't even recognize her without it if she had a hypercharge or not. You get what I mean? Anyways, that's going to be it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.